On the back of that video about Phil Shiner, the lawyer who effectively embezzled £3.6 million from the Legal Aid Board, a lot of people obviously were asking, is there any chance of getting that money back? Well, there are certainly legal routes to get that money back. I mean, whether there's any money to be got back is another story. But let me explain about what we call POCA, Proceeds of Crime Act. And there's also a few other things that are related to that I'll touch on, such as unexplained wealth orders. I mean, the first thing to note in this particular case is the Legal Services Commission, Legal Aid Authority, whatever they're called this week, they do actually have a power anyway to claw back legal aid funds that were given in error. And this was certainly an error. But they can actually claw them back if they sort of go, well, technically we shouldn't give you legal aid in the first place. That's another reason a lot of people don't do legal aid work. It can be quite risky like that. But what's proceeds of crime? Well, if somebody is convicted of an offence, then there can be a separate hearing to confiscate their ill-gotten gains. But the thing to remember is, when we talk about confiscation, as the law reports say, this is not confiscation in the sense that a schoolboy would understand it, you know, putting your catapult in the head teacher's drawer. They actually go after turnover, not profit. It's any benefit that you've had any connection with. And the definition of benefit is very wide and doesn't really comport with the everyday way we describe it. So it's possibly best to give an example. I mean, the classic example is sort of a dealing of illicit substances. Say you've got £10,000 worth of something illegal. And I collect it from somebody, I pass it on to somebody else, they pass it on to somebody else, it all gets distributed down the chain. Well, the fact that I had that £10,000 worth of produce in my hands, even if I'm only getting a few £100 for distributing it, the benefit is £10,000. There was another case where a guy rented a skip to some friends and he charged them £200. Now he knew that they were actually going and illegally just going in somewhere and stripping the lead off the roof, that sort of thing. As it happens, they went in and they got £250,000 worth of sort of valuable metals. So what was the benefit to this one guy? Well, as far as the courts were concerned, it was £250,000. You can't just say, well, I only got £200 out of it. It's the same with if you are dealing. You can't say, well, I've got overheads. I have to buy this stuff wholesale in the first place before I sell it on. It's the actual maximum value. And it's everybody who touches it in the chain. They are all deemed to have benefited. And it's quite a strict an onerous procedure the way they do it, because they start with the assumption that everything you have earned in the last 6 years from the date that you were proceeded against, and it's the earliest date, if you're done for lots of offences, it's the earliest date. So they go, right, everything you have gained in the last 6 years, any income whatsoever, we're going to assume it's proceeds of crime unless you can prove to the contrary. Now, one thing to remember, this is all done on the civil standard of proof. So it's, balance of probabilities. Is it more likely than not? But you literally have to go there and you have to sort of say, right, well, this income, and I paid for the house, here's my legitimate income, here's my legitimate wages. But what if, say, for instance, you go, well, I bought that out of my lottery winnings. I bought a lottery ticket. Well, where did you get the pound to buy the lottery ticket? We're going to say that was part of your criminal lifestyle. So all your lottery winnings are ours as well. And they're very draconian about it. They look at everything. They chase for everything, every present you've ever given a family member, every benefit, if you buy the family home. And you have these proceedings. Now, just to give an anecdote, I had one where it was a guy, he'd been convicted of possession with intent to supply, with manufacturing really, Class C. And to money launder, he'd set up a restaurant that he let his wife run. But she was such a brilliant restaurateur and the food was so amazing, the restaurant actually made massive profits. So they were still trying to hide all this stuff. But we had the hearing and they were looking at, well, what's his benefit? What's his realisable assets? And his girlfriend turned up to say, actually, that house belongs to me. It's, I am the legal owner. So his wife had come to support him as well, and that's when she found out for the first time that the family home where she had raised their three children belonged to the fancy woman. And I'll tell you, you've never seen somebody who was so happy to be in custody. Because I went down to see him and he's like, how's she taking this? It's like, well, not well, mate. He goes, do they allow legal visits, not here. And it's like, whew, you know, it's like, oh, well, I'm sure she'll realise. But at least somebody kept the house. But, you know, that's what they go after. Now, obviously, like in the case of that guy with the skip, he's probably not got £250,000. So when they make an order, it has two numbers on it. It has the benefit and the realisable assets. And I've done ones where it's like, you know, especially, you know, in some of the major conspiracies for dealing and things like that, where it's been, you know, the benefit is X million pounds, realisable assets £1, because, you know, people don't have this thing. It's a rather strange thing that most people in organised crime actually earn less than minimum wage. It's only the guys at the top who do very well out of it. But yeah, you have these hearings. You can sort of agree to settle them. Also, they can go back beyond the 6 years. If they say you've been doing this for 30 or 40 years, or, you know, you've been a gangster all your life, they can go back for everything. Although once you get beyond the 6 years, the burden shifts, and it's for them to prove that it's actually, you know, proceeds of crime. You don't have to prove that it isn't. But again, they only have to prove on the balance of probabilities. You can settle these. I had one once where, I can't go into too many details, but as it happened, all the lawyers involved in this, the actual defendant organisation and the prosecuting authority, we'd all taken part in something called it was a particular challenge where we were up on some moors and we were having to survive on the moors for a weekend, living off survival rations. It was one of those sorts of things. And it had gone really hideously wrong. It was really, really bad. The weather was awful. Of the 40 teams that entered, only 4 finished. And we arrived at the sort of campsite on the Saturday, you know, the halfway point, and we were just so miserable and depressed. We were all huddled around trying to get warm. And actually the Royal Marines saved us, because they'd put a team in who instantly had started to just ran off. So while the rest of us were all struggling and disappearing and having to be rescued by helicopters, not only had they sort of legged it ahead, they actually took a detour to go to a pub to watch a football match, watch the football match, and then still arrived at the first checkpoint first. And they'd basically just cooked for us, and it's the best meal I've ever had. It was MRE, sausage and beans and chocolate pudding all mixed up in one bowl. Just needed the calories. But we sat there actually and we settled the case. We said, look, we've got this hearing coming up, blah blah blah, we've been pulling spreadsheets, we've been doing all the paperwork, let's try and agree a figure. And because you can do that, and we actually agreed a sum that everybody could live with. So that's if you are convicted. What if you're not convicted? You can still go after it. Say, for instance, somebody has fled the jurisdiction, so there's no way that they can bring them to trial. But they say, well, look, you know, they have benefited from crime. Then, yeah, they can actually go to the court and say, we say this person is a criminal and has benefited from crime, and we'd like an order saying that they owe this much back. And the courts will grant that, and then you enforce them in the same way you would enforce any sort of court judgment. So you can actually, if you've got a treaty with a foreign jurisdiction, so, you know, if they've got assets outside the jurisdiction, but it's somebody we're on friendly terms with, you can say, we want that house, or we want that super yacht, or we want this collection of cars, or indeed we just want access to these bank accounts. There's a convention called Lugano II, which was all the EU and EFTA countries agree to enforce each other's judgments. After Brexit, that nearly went away, but literally about 3 minutes before it elapsed, they did a little side treaty just to renew that. But we have reciprocal agreements with a few countries, so you can chase money abroad. Also, we have what we call unexplained wealth orders. If they suspect that somebody is what we call a politically exposed person from a non-EU country, and they've got, like, appear to have lots of money, more than £50,000 worth of assets that we can't quite explain, or you just suspect somebody is either involved in crime themselves or associated with somebody involved in crime themselves, then they can write and say, right, explain how you paid for all this. Now, you don't actually have to respond, but the answer, or the lack of answer, can be held against you if they then go for civil proceedings to try and recover that money. So this is why you should always, you know, if you're involved in a life of crime, always have a source of legitimate income that you can point to and say that's where it came from. I mean, at some stage I'll have to do a video on money laundering. It's really hard to do a video on money laundering that isn't a sort of practical guide to money laundering. You know, I'm very, very into art and art law, as you know. And I was lucky enough to go to an Interpol seminar on money laundering in the art world. And my friend who'd invited me said, You were taking a lot of suspicious notes during that. He's like, no, it's a very interesting topic. But you know, like the art world is notorious for money laundering. I mean, now actually, if you deal in more than 10,000 euros worth of art in a year, you must actually have an anti-money laundering officer on your books to try and clamp down on this. But yeah, I will do something at some stage about that. And you get all sorts of sham litigation. That's another thing we are warned about, that people will use sham litigation to money launder. You know, people will sue each other and then they will settle out of court. So then they'll transfer the money. And when people say, well, where did that money come from? Say, I had a court case and the other side settled. Now, it used to be, in the days before Part 36 offers. The Part 36 offer is a formal offer to settle a case for a sum of money. But you don't actually have to produce the money. You just have to say either, you know, we will pay you this amount of money to end this case. And it's up to the other side whether they accept it. You just do that by a letter. But in the old days, you had to pay the money into court. You had to physically go down there and say, here's the cash. We've paid it into court. It's there if you want it. You can draw it down if you want it. But people were going along, paying the money into court in cash, because the court office would take cash, then turning up going, oh, we've settled this now, can we withdraw the money? And they say, oh, well, we don't actually have it, it's all, you know, we've put it all like locked away safely. Oh, sorry, I'll take a cheque. And then you've got a cheque from, you know, HM Treasury. So, you know, it's like not more legit than that. So they have actually clamped down on that now, obviously, but that's getting quite funny. The other thing to remember about confiscation proceedings is, where does the money go? Does it go to the victims? No, it goes initially to the Treasury. It's completely different from compensation. What they're saying is, we are recovering your ill-gotten gains. You've made a profit on this. We might not be even able to track the victims down or track where you've got it. You know, if you've sold loads of illicit substances, it's not like they're going to go around and find everybody and say, you know, here's your £25 back for buying that little bag of whatever. The Treasury keep it. However, now there is a new procedure where if a court has ordered compensation as well, what they say is the Treasury will recover the money under proceeds of crime, but then they will pay out the compensation from that. So that way the person subject to the order gets the benefit of having paid it back. Because if you don't pay the money back that you were ordered to do, you go to prison in lieu. So it's like you must pay back £100,000, or you go to prison for another 2 years, or you must pay back £1 million, or you go to prison for another 5 years. So the idea is that you can say, well, I'll pay you first so I'm not going to prison, but then they will actually divvy up the compensation between the victims, and they'll do it on a, you know, if somebody's paying in dribs and drabs, because, you know, you can sometimes do that and say, I'll pay it back at X a month or X a year. They will then take that and then they will distribute it. If you're the only victim, great, you get it all as it comes in. If there's a bunch of you, they just divvy it up between you. An interesting thing is, in the same way we have private prosecutions, we now have private confiscation proceedings. And it's actually Virgin who did this. They went after loads of people bootlegging skyboxes. And they said, oh, we will bring the private prosecution, but also we want the confiscation proceedings for all the money that they got. And this was before the sort of compensation rule came in, where they would give you the compensation first. So they did a deal. They actually did a deal, and they said, we'll split any recovered proceeds of crime. And the defence actually challenged that and said, this is a bit tacky and mercenary, because this is just a privatisation of the criminal justice system. But the Court of Appeal said, yeah, we accept that, but let's be realistic about this. The only way we're going to be able to afford to prosecute complex frauds like this and complex IP infringement is if the private sector pays for it, and they're not going to do that just for the good of their health. They want something out of it. So it's to a mutual benefit. We get the clear up rate with all the crimes, and the Treasury gets some of the money. But effectively, you are just renting out the criminal justice system. You know, you're sort of going, give us a court, we'll prepare the case, we'll bring our own lawyers, and we'll sort everything out as well, and we'll just give you a little taste of it at the end. So you can see why people think that's a bit tacky. But there you go. And like I say, it's not just big, high-profile cases that do this. You know, even if you're doing sort of street-level dealing, they will make confiscation orders and, you know, just take your little ratty old car. I mean, the order itself, even if they say like a house is, you know, clearly the proceeds of crime, the order just has the cash. If you could find the cash from somewhere else to pay it off, they won't necessarily go after the asset that they think is, you know, the one that you bought with it. Although a lot of the time that's the only realisable asset anyway. But the piece of paper just says this is how much they owe, and it is enforced pretty much the same way as any other private judgment. Similarly, you know, people will try and go bankrupt and insolvent. That doesn't get you out of it, because apparently Phil Shiner, I'm not suggesting anything untoward here, but he apparently transferred a lot of his assets into the name of his daughter before all this kicked off. So now there will be proceedings, no doubt, to try and claw that back, because it's the same way in bankruptcy. You know, any transfers in the last 2 years, especially if they're undervalued, they can just claw it back anyway. But even if they're actually legit transfers, they can say, for full value, they say no, that wasn't yours to be giving away in the first place because you knew these bankruptcy proceedings were on the horizon. So, you know, there is a bit of an overlap there between sort of civil recovery. But there you go. I think I've pretty much about covered everything there. So, as always, hope you found that vaguely useful, vaguely interesting, vaguely accurate. Again, just back at Pentia. I know it's a bit of a fallback position, but it's just a nice place to come, and there's some quite nice views, which I'll just try and grab you one now, if I can do this. So those are those islands that I quite like, and across the other side of the bay, that's that Polyjoke place. You know, I did my Dyson video that apparently you all really liked. You've all got it in for it's James Dyson, the vacuum cleaner man, not Freeman Dyson, the cosmologist. But actually, Polyjoke is just over the other side. Actually, I'm not going to pad this out, but somebody asked me about, because there's an amusing Freeman Dyson story. Feel free to disconnect now, but this is sort of related to crime. Freeman Dyson was a bit of a character. So in his student days, him and a mate, they bought a park bench. And they got a receipt for it and everything. And they would hang around in Central Park carrying this bench around at night. So obviously when the police would go, what are you doing? They would come up to them and say, oi, stop stealing. And they go, no, this is our bench. How dare you? Here's a receipt. Stop harassing us. Now, eventually the police cottoned onto that. So they just started ignoring them. And as soon as they started ignoring them, they went in and they stole all the actual park benches. So there you go. I'm not recommending you do that either. So no art world money laundering and no stealing park benches.